Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Steelman, Director of Alumni Career Management and Professional Networks at William & Mary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, Enhance Your Communications. Today's webinar is part of a new William & Mary webinar series and is made possible by the support of the William & Mary Alumni Association. As we seek to provide relevant programming for our lifelong commitment to our alumni, we welcome any feedback and ideas to make this a valuable resource for you. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will notify registrants once the recording is available online. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our guest presenter today. It is important to note that if you are experiencing any audio or video difficulties throughout the webinar, to contact the Adobe Connect technical support number at 1-800-422-3623. Also, questions are welcome throughout the presentation, and our presenter will answer as many questions as time will allow. You can submit your questions by typing them in the box just below the PowerPoint presentation. Throughout the webinar, I will monitor those questions and share them with our presenter at the end of her presentation. Please note, if you are having any audio issues of sound between my voice and our guest speaker's voice, to just let me know and we'll adjust our microphone settings accordingly. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter this afternoon. Rebecca Staton-Reinstein is a president of Advantage Leadership Inc. and works with leaders and organizations to execute robust strategic plans, engage team members, and delight customers. Rebecca works with people around the world to think more critically and strategically and communicate more effectively, efficiently, and compellingly. Rebecca is the author of numerous books, including how-to guides to strategic planning and conventional wisdom, how today's leaders plan, perform, and progress like the founding fathers, combining her love of history honed in Williamsburg as a guide for the restoration in business. Rebecca received her BS in biology from our very own School of Arts and Sciences and has an MA from Indiana University and a PhD in organizational development from Union Institute and University. We are truly delighted to have Rebecca join us this afternoon from Florida to share her advice with the William & Mary tribe. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. So glad you're here with us today. And I want to tell you that I really, over the years, have come to appreciate my education at William & Mary more and more as I go along. And that's not only in my own work when I had a real job and after I founded my own company, but as I've worked in other countries and in various colleges in the U.S. And it was really a fascinating time that I spent in Williamsburg. And I did, in fact, work for the restoration. There I am on the left in my costume as at Raleigh Tavern. And there I am on the right in a publicity shot for my book on the Constitutional Convention. When I was at William & Mary, there was a room on the first floor of the Wren building of the college that we still used as a classroom and may still be in use now. And we sat at those very uncomfortable desks, 2 people to a bench, and then we wrote on a kind of a slanted surface there. And of course the occasional tourist wandered through to see what we were up to. But despite the discomfort, it was a very exciting time, and that's where I was first introduced to the work of Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. And I'm going to talk a lot about his work today. It forms the basis of a lot of what I want to say. So enhancing your communication, it's a very broad subject. And we obviously, in an hour, aren't going to cover everything. But I do want to try to narrow it down and give you some practical strategies for being more effective when you communicate. So the first thing is, and I would like you to think about this and think about your interactions with other people and how you interact and so forth and where you may have some challenges. And after the webinar is over, before you go too long and forget everything that we're talking about today, I want to suggest that you answer this question about what you bring to any of your communications, your interactions, and how you interact, and make some notes about it. Because I think what most of us will find is that there are some assumptions we make as we interact with the other person that begin to affect how we communicate with them. And it'll also maybe reveal some patterns to you that you can then do something about after you think about the topics we're going to cover. So that's your homework. All right. So today, as what we do becomes more complex, how we communicate, how we do our work becomes more important. And that's because more and more is expected of people at the workplace today. In a globalized economy, I may be trying to communicate with my colleagues and teammates who are in some other part of the world. We're on different time zones, even here in the U.S. So it becomes much more difficult and much more important that we learn how to really communicate much more effectively. So we're going to spend some time today talking about what part personality plays in our communication. And many companies today use some fairly common assessments. One of the favorites is the DISC, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, Keirsey sorter, temperament sorter, and of course many, many others. And they're widely used and really quite useful in helping us get a grasp of that. So now we're going to take a quick survey just to see which ones of these common ones you've used, or if you've used another one, or you've never used any of these so-called personality assessments or quizzes. All right, we're watching the things fill up, and so we have about 15% of you have never done one of these. About 84% of the folks have said they've done Myers-Briggs. Another 46% have done DISC. Few of you have done the Keirsey, and then about a third of you other surveys. And that's quite interesting. The Myers-Briggs, in fact, is the most widely used and the most studied, validated, and verified in the world. It's been translated into many languages, and I've had an opportunity to use it in many places. So I think the survey is kind of reflective. And for those of you who've never done one of these, that kind of is third, looks like about 15%. I think you'll learn today a little bit about how this process can be useful to you. Okay. Thanks, Michael, for putting that up there for us. So when I was first studying Carl Jung's work at William & Mary, I was most interested in the fact that he focused on normal psychology. And of course, I wasn't the only one who had noticed that. And Catherine Briggs, whose picture you see there on the left side of your screen, also thought it was really quite fascinating, quite interesting. And she had been trying to develop her own system to understand differences in people's way of communicating and so forth. And when Carl Jung published his work, Psychological Type, in 1923, and she had a chance to read it. It was first published in English in 23. She realized that he had gone, of course, much further than she was going. She started communicating with him. They communicated for years and discussed his ideas. But Jung was not interested in creating any sort of assessment, or what some people might call a personality test. And so Catherine Briggs recruited her daughter, Isabel Myers, to work on the assessment that she kind of started to put together herself. And they used Jung's categories and began to develop a series of questions. And if you've taken Myers-Briggs, you answered those questions. And of course, they've been updated a little bit over time, but are really quite very similar to the early ones. And so what we're going to do today is use these Jungian categories and the Myers and Briggs's approaches to help us understand ourselves and others, especially around that whole issue of communication. And as we go through the categories, I'm going to ask you to think about two things. One, which of the descriptions really sounds more like you? None of us will be 100% because we all have all of the characteristics. But if you had to choose between one or the other, which really hits more bases with you? And think about somebody that you communicate with on a regular basis. Maybe it's someone at work, maybe it's someone in your personal life, but think about that person and think about these categories and say, that sounds an awful lot like Joe. And I think it'll begin to help you see some of those places where you and Joe click immediately, and some of those places where you kind of scratch your head and say, huh? What's Joe talking about here? And so that's what we're going to try to look at. Let's go to Jung's first category. And it's really based on where we get our energy. People with the extroversion preference get their energy from the external world, people and things. And people who have the introversion preference get their energy from the internal world of thoughts and ideas. So when we're looking at energy, that outward focus, we often find that people with the extroverted preference think aloud. In conversation, they'll take the lead, and their ideas and thoughts kind of come rolling out easily. If they're in a brainstorming session, they often throw out lots and lots and lots of ideas. Very spontaneous sorts of folks. And sometimes they kind of speak in a word salad that you have to kind of spend some time extracting the essence. But extroversion does not mean that you're a big mouth. It's a common misunderstanding of folks with this preference. Now, people who have the introversion preference like to think things through before they share their ideas. They want to kind of get their ducks in a row, so to speak. And in brainstorming, they want to know what we're going to be discussing ahead of time so that they can ponder it and think about it, get their ideas organized. Sometimes people find it kind of hard to pull their ideas out and may even think the introvert is very aloof. But introversion does not mean that you're shy. Okay, so which of these seems more like you? And think about that other person you're going to try to understand also, and what seems more like them. So communicating with, let's do a quick quiz here. See which one seems more like you. Give you a couple of seconds to complete that. All right. Looks like about a little over 80% think that you're more introverted. About 16% more extroverted. All right. So let me give you a couple of clues, tips when you're communicating with someone of the opposite type. So when you're communicating with an extrovert, very often it helps to let them kind of take the lead in the conversation. You want to keep that conversation moving because this is a very active preference. you have to make sure that you give them some nonverbal cues that you're listening, agreeing or even disagreeing, but you have to kind of show them. They're going to look for those visual cues. And you may ask them questions that are going to help them organize their thoughts, get rid of a lot of the stray ideas that come popping out. Now, when you're communicating with an introvert, you have to be patient. You're also going to ask a lot of questions because you want to help them express their thoughts and allow them time to answer. They need to kind of think it through, remember, before they share their ideas. All right, let's look at the second category that Jung discusses. And he believed that the core of our personality is the way that we gather information and then use that information to make decisions. And he identified two areas. He said people with the sensing preference use their five senses first. And so they use information that they can see, smell, taste, touch, hear. They like facts. People with the intuiting preference also use facts, but they're much more interested in what's the meaning behind those facts. What's the story that the data are telling us? And for many years, it was very difficult for some folks to understand folks with the intuiting preference. Now that we can kind of hook people up, put those little devices on their heads and do some really good neuroscience, and we look at their brains, we see that different parts of the brain are lighting up. It's almost like if you were playing pinball. You'll see lots of different pieces of the brain lighting up all at once because they're gathering information from all over, and they're going to put it together in a new way. For the sensing preference, you'll see a very different pattern, and it's much more systematic, going from one to the next. So sensors, those with this preference, focus on the details. They're interested in every leaf on that tree, the shape and dimensions of the branches. They always want more information. They want more detail. And they're often impatient when you're imprecise with your language or what you're talking about, and they tend to take things very literally. People with the intuiting focus look, of course, at the big picture. They're much more interested in the whole forest and its interactions, its ecology, and so forth. And they're impatient with too much detail. They like to leap from idea to idea. They may be too vague in their when they're expressing their ideas, especially for sensors. So, which preference is more descriptive of you and that other person you're thinking of? Sensing or intuiting? Details or big picture? All right. This is interesting. A few more intuitors. No, we're back to 50-50. All right. So let's give a few tips on how to communicate with sensors and intuitors. So when we are communicating with sensors, be concise and precise. Provide as much detail as you possibly can. And when you're describing something and how to do it, go step by step. First we do this, then we do that, then we do the next. And when you're communicating with an intuitor, don't bog down in too much detail. Show the implications of the fact. Tell a story. Use analogies. Help them get to that bigger picture that is so interesting to them. Jung's third category was the way in which we now take that information, whether we got it through the sensing approach or the intuiting approach, and now using it to make decisions. Those with the thinking preference for decision making want to use a kind of an impersonal logic. They like to kind of stand outside the circle of the decision and use their analytical powers to figure out what's going on. Folks with the feeling preference prefer to stand inside that circle. They want to make sure that the people who are going to be affected by this decision, that we take that into consideration, that we consider their values when we're making a decision. And I must tell you, both approaches are logical. Subjective logic for the feelers and objective logic for the thinkers. Now, Mr. Spock is kind of the exaggerated thinking type because he's tried to suppress all of his emotions. But seriously, the thinking approach may seem a little cold or distant to others, but because no matter how thinkers get their information, sensing or intuiting, they use their analytical powers to make that objective, logical decision. But remember, thinkers are not without emotion. They just don't necessarily show a lot of their feelings to the world. And they try not to have their feelings involved in their decision making. Of course, Counselor Troy is the ultimate feeler, an empath. Now, that also carries it to a bit of an extreme. But people with the feeling preference are often more empathic. And no matter how they get their information, sensing or intuiting, they want to include the impact on the people of this decision. They want to make sure that, and they put a big emphasis on making sure their values are involved in the decision and how their values are impacted. And feelers are not necessarily emotional. And any more than thinkers are more like Spock, and feelers are more kind of like a Troy. But I think you get the point. So once again, let's come back and think about ourselves and our own ways of making decisions, and that other person who may want to do it. So thinking about yourself, which is more like you thinking or feeling. All right, we're watching you respond. We're back to 50-50 again. Okay, so about half of us are thinkers, half of us are feelers. All right, so let's give a few tips on how to get along with that other type. Look towards the end, we had a little change. I think we had a few less feelers, a few more thinkers. Okay, so when you're communicating with a thinker, you want to be logical and analytical and not emotional. If you have something to explain to a thinker, you want to do it in an unemotional way. But it's important to communicate with them because you have to get them to understand the importance of considering how the decision is going to affect the people who are going to be affected by it, or the values of the folks. So in communicating with feelers, be sure to discuss how that decision will affect other people and their values, but also ask them to see if they can kind of stand outside and be a little less subjective in their decision making. All right, we come now to the way in which we organize our life. This is the fourth, and although Jung didn't talk about it directly, Myers-Briggs, and of course the people who've studied it since, believe it's implied in his work. So let's look at judgers versus feelers. Because those with the judging preference like to plan the work, work the plan. They want to make a decision and move on. They like to be organized. Those with the perceiving preference prefer to be more open and to make a decision and then maybe change that decision when something else comes along, to deviate from the plan. They tend to be a little more spontaneous. So it's the joy of closure versus the joy of processing. So as we look at our judges, the joy of closing, they love checking things off their list. They like finishing something off. That's when they get their thrill. And when the work is done, then we can play, is their approach. And they often appear driven. We might describe them popularly as being that kind of type A personality, hard charging. But they're not necessarily judgmental. When we look at perceivers, well, now we come to that joy of processing. People with this preference enjoy the journey. In fact, the process may be more important, more interesting to them than the destination. There's always time for play for the perceivers. And others may often accuse them of being procrastinators or unfocused. But they're not. They're just not into rushing into that decision making and taking the action. I'm going to give it a little more thought. So again, thinking about yourself and that person you're trying to understand, what's more like you? Let's take a new survey here. Okay. It looks like we have a preponderance of those with the judging preference here today, and a minority, 18%, with the perceiving preference. And so let's talk a little bit about how then you communicate with one another. So when you're trying to communicate with judges, you want to get to the point right away. Present your ideas succinctly and be ready to take action quickly. You have to move just like that. And there's sometimes, especially in a team, when your job may be to kind of slow the judges down a little bit. Because when you're making very important decisions, it may be more important to get more information, to consider more ideas, than to make that judgment quickly. So you want to think about that. Now, when you're communicating with perceivers, you're going to slow down a little bit. You're going to explore some options and possibilities and be ready to change course. With perceivers, you may need to nudge them a little bit to make them make that decision if they're really taking too long, or to take that action. So, at the end of the day, one of the ways that we can communicate more effectively is to do what we call flexing. And this means using our non-preferences sometimes is the best way to be able to communicate with the other person, to speak their language. So in flexing, we access those parts of our own communication and personality that aren't necessarily as well developed, but they're quite useful. For example, when I'm in France, I trot out some of my French and try to use it to the best of my ability to communicate, get along, read street signs, menus. And this is great. When I am not in France anymore, I put it away. I don't have to speak French in my daily life. And it's kind of a good analogy for thinking about beginning to flex. And I didn't make this clear earlier. Let me just stop for a moment and help you understand that we're all born with all of the options here. We all have the ability to be more extroverted, more introverted, more sensing, more intuiting, more thinking, more feeling, more judging, more perceiving. But as we mature in life, and sometimes this is very clear in children from very early age, we begin to kind of go down one path. And the more we go down that one path, the more that becomes established as a real preference for us. It becomes our go-to option. And what we have to do when we're flexing is kind of dig deep inside and pull up that non-preference. Polish it off. Learn some of the skills. We're not changing our personality. True type is embedded. Not going to change at this stage of the game. But what we do is we access the skills that someone with that preference might use. We dust them off and use them, like my French when I'm in France, and use it with that person to be more effective in our communication, and then put it back when we don't need it. Flexing is all about tuning in to the other person. Then what exactly does that mean? Well, there are kind of three basic steps. The first, what's my preferred style? And that's why it's important to kind of understand yourself first before you try to understand other folks. What's my preference? When it comes, especially since communication is what we're talking about today. And that's going to help me understand, okay, I need to flex or I don't need to flex with this person I'm talking to. I can go with my basic preference, or no, I'm going to have to kind of reach inside and pull in something else because I'm going to identify the other person's needs. I'm going to tune in. I want to try to figure out, what's their preference in this area? And then I'm going to flex to adjust my approach to their needs. I'm going to speak their language. And this is critical. I always have to be the one to take this action. I can't wait for them to flex. And it may not be fair, but hey, it works. We also have to remember that everyone is unique. Even when we share the same preferences, if we shared all four of the Jungian preferences exactly the same, there would still be shades of difference because our experience is different. We're different people, we've had different life experiences, different things have affected us, and so forth. So keep that always at the back of your mind. So we all use our different styles, and the difference is the emphasis and the order, what we call our preference. Now, there's a lot more to preference than we're able to talk about today in this seminar, but at least I hope you've got a little bit of the basics, and then you can apply it to your communication. Let me give you an analogy. For those of you who like analogies, think about a house. A house has many rooms in it, but I bet you spend most of your time in one room or another. And so that's kind of what your preferences are. They're your lived-in favorite rooms where you feel most comfortable. Okay. I want to give you another set of insights into thinking about communication. And now I'm going to fall back on being a biology major at William & Mary, because this is where I began to be introduced into understanding the human brain. And even way back in the dark ages when I went to William and Mary, we understood that buried deep at the bottom of the brain, there's a little organ called the amygdala. And this organ is fascinating. In the trade, we call it the lizard brain. But in all seriousness, this filters the information from our five senses, and the information goes to the amygdala long before we are even aware of it. Think about yourself. Have you ever been driving down the highway, zipping along, maybe even going a little faster than the speed limit, when all of a sudden a big truck looms in front of you, passes into your lane, you're about to crash? Think about it for a moment. What's your reaction? What's happening? What's going on? Well, long before you're even aware that that truck has veered into your lane, your amygdala has sent out signals to all parts of your body to get ready to fight or flight. It has already sent a signal that puts you kind of on high alert, that puts that foot on the brake, that swerves the steering wheel, that moves you out of that almost before you're even aware that that's really going on. And this fight or flight instinct is basic. It saves our lives. And it's quite useful, especially back in the day when we were tramping along the savannas of Africa. And that's when we picked up that scent of that tiger looming in the grass ahead, and we're ready to either go jump on him with our spear or run away. Well, that was great, and it saves our lives, as I've said. But you know what? It doesn't serve us well day to day in lots of regular situations, and yet it gets triggered. We have to remember in thinking about this that the amygdala has no higher functions. It sends out its messages to our body to react. It's a reactionary organ, but it can't think. And that's why over the years you've probably found out that when you feel yourself getting ready and angry and upset, that just counting to 10, the old count to 10. Why? Because the amygdala can't count. It forces you back up into the thinking part of your brain. So what's going on here? What we have to avoid is the amygdala hijacking. That's when we lose it. That's when the amygdala is triggered and we can't calm down right away. And this can happen just sitting in a meeting, not just when we're about to crash on the highway. Someone says something that we don't like, or that makes us angry, or we disagree very strongly with. And you feel yourself starting to react. And when you're in that situation, we've lost it. Now, I can lose it in the fight sense, go wackadoodle, or in the total withdrawal sense. Both of these are in the amygdala hijacking, when I just walk away from the whole thing, and whether I physically leave the meeting or mentally leave the meeting. It's the same thing. So the key is, the simple thing is to learn how to stop it in its tracks. We're all human. We all start to react in these situations. And what we have to learn to do is to calm down as quickly as possible. So let's see if we can figure out what are some of the physical things. We have a little survey here of what are some of the physical reactions that you might notice about yourself. And you can, of course, choose more than one of these. Some of them are all going on. Heart racing. Yeah, the face or the neck getting red. The stomach tightening up. Shallow breathing. Arms and legs tense up. And then, of course, lots of other things going on. And that's because the amygdala has sent out those messages, the adrenaline's kicked in, and we're ready. The heart is racing, pumping that blood out to the extremities. We notice our face getting red. The stomach is tightening up because the amygdala has already sent a signal that says, hey, we don't need to be digesting now. We need to be either running away or getting ready to fight. That's why our arms and legs are tense and ready to go, and many, many other reactions. So what I want to be able to do is to encounter those and then do something with it and not go with that craziness, either the extreme fight or the extreme flight. So what can I do? Well, luckily, another interesting psychologist is a fellow named William Bridges. Now, I didn't learn about Bridges at William & Mary, but I learned about him many years later. And he's laid out a kind of a model that helps us understand how we can kind of move through a series of steps so that we can communicate effectively and get ourselves back on track. And in his model, he starts with denial, and that's the kind of the flight response. That's where some people go almost immediately. We kind of are a little engineered to go one way or the other. So folks who go into the denial or flight, well, there is no problem. There's nothing going on here, folks. Move along. But you can't sustain that in the face of something going on. So most of us move into resistance if we don't go there immediately. And the mistake we make when we're in that resistance, the person has brought up something in the meeting, has said something that really we don't like, and we're ready for battle. Because now I'm going to intensify my attempt to get that person to get on my side and understand why they're wrong and why my idea is right. And so we argue stronger and stronger. Well, all that does is set off the same resistance in the other person, and now we're kind of in that death spiral. We're not going to get any place. I want to get to acceptance. That means we are both now trying to understand what's going on, and we're going to get to a place where we come to a resolution. But how do I get there? You see, I can't make you go over there to the acceptance, to that place where we're having a good dialogue and are going to come to an agreement. Now, if I have more power than you, I can make you acquiesce, but that's just another form of denial. You have to decide that you're going to engage in dialogue with me and we're going to resolve this. Since I can't make you get there, what can I do? Well, I can help you get into that stage in between, into the neutral zone. In the zone of exploration. And so this is where I'm going to ask a lot of questions and help you and me focus on figuring out things. The asking of questions is a strong psychological trigger that we are hardwired to engage with the other person. All you have to do is watch any politician coming out of a meeting, wandering through the halls. Reporter yells a question, and they find it almost impossible not to come out and then say something off the top of their head that they often regret. Now, we're not being manipulative here. All I'm doing is I'm going to ask you questions in such a way that you're now going to slowly engage with me. And that's the key. So I'm going to manage my amygdala. And I want to build a bridge from resistance through the exploration to acceptance. I'm going to use a technique we call aligned assertive communication. And it's a simple technique that I think you'll find easy to understand and, of course, use. Aligned assertive communication means I try to identify with you. It's as if there's a wall, the problem's on the other side of the wall, and you and I are on the same side of the wall. See, in resistance, I'm on the other side of the wall from you. You're over there with the problem. We're never going to get to agreement there. We're never going to figure out a solution. So I have to be on the same side of the wall with you, and you might say something like, I understand how you can feel that way. Because you can understand that. You may have felt that way yourself. Assertive communication means that I am not being aggressive, but I'm being assertive. I'm communicating calmly. I'm using statements of fact. I might say something, I'm confident we'll find a mutually agreeable solution. See, in combination, they're very powerful. So here's the basic model. Over here to the left, and at the top of the screen, we have our most primitive reactions, fight or flight. And when I'm being assertive, as opposed to aggressive, the stuff in the gray below is our most primitive reaction. When I'm being aggressive, then that amygdala business is going full charge. When I'm in my fight mode. When I'm being passive, I'm in my flight mode. And when I combine the two to passive-aggressive, we love this stuff when we watch sitcoms. If you watch them closely, you'll see that it's mostly passive-aggressive types of humor. And that's great, but it doesn't help us any in communicating well with others. So I want to convert that aggression into assertiveness. I want to get out of that fight mode of aggression and be assertive, state facts. I want to move out of that passive role into the aligned role where we are both on the same side. I'm trying to understand you and be with you on this. And aligned assertive is when we combine the two. So let's look how that really works. In good communication, the assertive statements are facts. My expectations, I'm sure we'll get a solution to this. I try to maintain a neutral voice, neutral body language, even relaxed and pleasant, and no attacks. And then aligning statements, I'm identifying with the issues, I'm identifying with the person, I'm trying to understand it. Now, to get ready, the first thing I have to do is calm my own emotions. Take that deep breath, count to 10, do whatever it is you do to kind of bring yourself back off the ledge. And then I have to have a mental intent that we're going to, at some point, agree. We're going to find a solution to this. And I usually try to express that. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. That question is going to get the dialogue going. I have to use inclusive language. That's why we always talk in the we. Right? I'm not going to say, well, you think this or I did that. No, I'm going to we language. I'm going to use conditional language. I'm going to use the could, would kind of things. And it has to be truthful. It has to be truthful. Those aligning statements must be absolutely truth because we will telegraph to the other person that I'm just giving you a lot of malarkey. And here's some don'ts. We do not use the word but or any of the other similar words, however, or even sometimes the rise of our voice without even saying a word, and we don't lie. These will end the communication right away. So here are the guides. First of all, I want to calm my own emotions first. I must intend to come to that mutual agreement. I'm going to ask questions to de-escalate the resistance. I'm going to use inclusive language, the we language, the us stuff. Conditional language, could or should. And I'm going to use the word and, not but. I'm going to keep it neutral and relaxed and I'm going to be truthful and sincere. This is critical. let's get to some concrete examples of this. I think that'll be useful. Here's some assertive statements or questions. What could we do differently? Could you expand your idea? What are your expectations of me? What part would you be willing to play? Aligning statements. I understand how you feel, and I see your point, and I can tell, and is the critical, believe me, when you first start trying to use this, it's going to seem pretty odd. But after you get used to it, you'll get that but business out, because what but implies is everything I said at the beginning of the sentence was a lie. We literally don't hear it, and we go on to the second part because that's when we're finally getting to the meat. And I want to break up that pattern which stalls the communication. And so here's some examples of aligned assertive statements and questions. I agree that's an issue, and I wonder what we could do to resolve it. You know, I've had a similar experience myself, and I need your guidance on how to handle this. We language could, would, but no buts. And no buts. All right, I think you get the idea. All right, I have a kind of final little quiz here. What actions will you take to apply your knowledge? We've given you kind of an open area to jot down some of your thoughts if you'd like to do that. What actions will you take? And I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about those things and maybe jot down a few for us if you feel like it. Bum, 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 bum. Keep the word and more in mind. Great. Absolutely. You'll see the difference. As I said at the beginning, it always seems awkward and contrived, but once it becomes kind of the habit, I think you'll get a good response out of that. Oh, we've got a lot of them. Okay. Commending colleagues, great work in online open forum. Oh, yes. Yes, so much trolling going on out there that that positive response can be very important. Focus on using and versus but, okay? Expect to reach a consensus. Expect agreement. Yes, you have to really force your mind into the space to set that up. That I am, and I often articulate this. This is especially important in those difficult agreements. And in many cases, if you think of the big controversies, conflicts around the world, is that they've gotten stuck in the resistance and they cannot make it over that leap into the exploration and finally to acceptance. Because there's an expectation that's very firmly held. The other side isn't serious. They don't really want to fix this. And you hear it all the time. Very, very important in moving us along. Understand that my wife, who's the extrovert, needs me to show with signs that I, the introvert, am listening. Oh, please. My husband and I go through this all the time. He's more extroverted, I'm the more introverted. And he says, don't sit there like the great stone face. Well, that's me. So I have to remember to nod, to say yes, to say no, to at least show him that I'm alive and listening. Excellent, excellent point. All right, try to figure out the other person's style. Be on the same side, absolutely. Keep remembering this. We have to get on the same side of that wall, not put the other person over there. Wow, these are some great responses. Thank you so much. I appreciate this. Great responses. Okay, so let's try to sum it up. And this is the essence of flexing. First of all, I speak your language. Second, I appreciate you. Third, I learn from our differences. So I speak your language is really where we've been focusing today. It's on flexing, figuring out, tuning into the other person, what they are, and trying to speak their language, speak French to the French people. Okay, but how do I get there? Well, obviously, we're going to tune in to the other person's preferences and try to use their skills as we go along. I appreciate you. Yeah? This is where I've got to breathe, count to 10, and do what I need to do to manage the old amygdala, the old lizard brain, and look for at least one thing about the other person that I can appreciate, genuinely appreciate. In one of the recent presidential debates, the last question was to tell something that you admire or appreciate about the other person. And it was a very powerful moment as the candidates who've been pretty fierce with each other were forced and in both cases it seemed rather genuine on both sides, saying, this is what I appreciate about you. This is what I see as a positive about you. So remember that and do it yourself. You have to get yourself there. And then number 3, learning from our differences. And again, this is not easy. This is pretty hard. But this is where, again, aligned, assertive communication is all about understanding those differences and learning from them and using those in a positive sense. I always like to close off all of my webinars with this quote from Sophocles, an old dead Greek guy, a statue of him in Athens. It says, knowledge must come through action. The real way this seminar is going to be of any use to you is when you go out and start practicing it, go out and start using it. And I always suggest you kind of take one little thing, and I think those ideas that you expressed a few minutes ago, of trying to start using and instead of but, of seeing the person on the other side, of remembering to show your listening to the other person, to give them those little cues, to be able to access and flex what you're doing. Pick one thing at a time. Don't try to change everything about your communication at once. But understand your own personality, understand the other person's, tune in, and find ways where you can get on that same page. And as we come up on the hour in just a few minutes, what are your questions? Do you have any other questions you'd like to ask before we finish off today?
Well,
and I think you can put them in the Q&A space.
Rebecca,
Michael, are you there?
I am here. And Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to present this terrific webinar on communications. I hope those watching today got a lot out of it. I'm excited myself. I learned a lot of interesting tips from you this afternoon, so I really appreciate you sharing your expertise that all started from your days in Wren Hall and in your courses
Yes.
studying Carl Jung. So for those of you joining us live, I'm going to do a quick survey here just before you go on to your next activities. But in the meantime, please do type in below the PowerPoint a question or two, and we'll do our best. If you have a few minutes after 1 to stay with us, please stay tuned, and hopefully we can address your questions. And as Rebecca has kindly put her contact information here on the screen, I urge all of you to stay in touch with her and follow her on LinkedIn and check out her book. Fascinating little connection of history to understanding people's leadership directions and how they've applied over the years of our forefathers into today. With that, Rebecca, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and launch this survey and ask the first question at the same time. So it should pop up in your
Great.
browser, and you'll see the opportunity to do so. But the first question I have, it kind of stemmed from some of the responses of actions. One in particular, the extroverted wife and the introverted husband, I think was the example given, and it brought to mind some of the ways that we communicate differently at home versus in the work environment. And I'm curious what your expertise has to say on that observation. I've noticed this with my friends, myself as well. We just tend to be different when we're with our family, whether good or bad examples could be probably shared. But I'm curious your expertise on
Right.
that observation.
Yeah, yeah, Mikey, you're absolutely right. In fact, that's why sometimes when people use Myers-Briggs or DISC or any of the other things at work, their answers come out very different than if they are only answering for themselves at home. It's because we adapt to our work environment. We figure out pretty quickly what's going on. Uh, and we, whether we're even conscious of it or not, we adapt. For example, most workplaces are very much of the judging preference. Make a decision, move on, take action, boom, 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 stay organized, plan the work, work the plan. And so there I was in the workplace. I had to adapt to that. I happen to be a perceiver, but I had to become a very good J. I had to learn those things and use them. In fact, I got to the point, one of my books is about strategic planning and how to go about planning. And this is for a person who was not naturally inclined to do a lot of planning or to stick with the plan. So we adapt to the work environment. And if you find that you're having a great deal of trouble adapting, it may be a time or a signal to you that this isn't a good place for you to be. You're not going to be at your best using all of your real talents. And it may be time to find a different type of work environment where you can really fully express yourself and be the best of you that you are. And I work with folks who are in that situation and need to move on or change or do something slightly different because we spend most of our working hours, most of our waking hours at work, thinking about work or doing email at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night with work. And so what we have to do is make sure that that work environment is bringing out the best in us. So thanks for that question, Michael. It really hit a very important point.
Well, thank you for your thoughts on that. That was very interesting. One question I had related to, you know, the kind of related to flex observations and how we be better at flexing our communications. Um, with online. We do these online networking hours, as you know, and it's all text based, and it's very, your time, so it's speed networking in its pure form, and so you have 8 minutes. Um, and communication styles are very hard to read in that environment. What advice would you give, sort of, when it's difficult to read somebody's preferences or to read just based on a few factors? Like, I guess it would kind of go back to the core advice that you gave at the end there with, focusing on certain types of statements. But what other tips might be valuable as we actually have and this is a shameless little plug, but on for those watching this in December, on the 22nd, we're doing a little last minute holiday networking with a ULOG themed online networking ULOG. So I hope those joining us today and watching this in the month of December can join us on December 22nd at noon Eastern time. But with that, what are your thoughts on networking with online environments?
Well, I think, and this is kind of off the top of my head, I think that those who are younger will find it perfectly acceptable because they spend an awful lot of their time texting and chatting and instant messaging and all of the other things that they do. Whereas somewhat older alums may find it a little off-putting, especially at the beginning until you get into it, because it is very difficult. You only have a few lines there to kind of get an idea across and so forth. And so being that spontaneous and expressing yourself concisely in a few words is not easy for certain personality types. So certain ones will take to it more easily than others. On the other hand, it's like everything else. You see, you can learn the skills. This is what flexing is all about, is if you can learn some of those skills. So if you find it a little off-putting at the beginning, think about that in terms of your own personality types, your own preferences, and say, okay, I don't enjoy this as much as I would, say, a live interaction. What are those parts of my personality where I'm going to have to kind of flex a little, understand how to use this particular approach and maximize it? Because, for example, you have always the problem when you're working in that environment is you don't have any visual cues to go from. You can't read the body language. You can't have your own body language. And I don't know if you're using emojis in this. It's a kind of pseudo way of showing that we're happy or something. But I think that that's the best advice I can give off the top of my head is think about the ways in which it makes you uncomfortable.
I think it's terrific. We haven't.
Go ahead.
No, I love it, and we haven't tried the yet, but maybe we should, and I'll have to talk to the developers on that one as an idea. But I think that's great advice, and it is very interesting administering these and designing them in a way that allows for what you were talking about earlier, and sort of accommodating the differences of introverts and extroverts' needs, and all of the great materials that you've presented today. I think we have time. I know we've gone way over the hour. I apologize, for those, but and thank you so much, Rebecca, for giving us a few more minutes of your time this afternoon. But I think it's worth asking one more question if we can do so. We all have probably more than one preference that we feel we are, and how can we be more than one? Is that okay? Is that sort of strategy or a strength, or how would you advise us in as we look at our preferences and
well,
with all that you've presented us
today? Each of the pairs are binary. You're either one or the other. What the difference comes, and sometimes some of them are not clear to us at all. The clarity really comes from our ability to look inside ourselves, our ability to look in and see. And some things are pretty clear to us, and some things not so clear. Well, sometimes I'm like this, and sometimes I'm like that. And that just simply is that lack of clarity, which we all have. We cannot see ourselves always as others see us. And with age, generally comes a greater understanding and acceptance of ourselves. And that's why when people have taken Myers-Briggs and say they took it, when they were 19 or so, and then they took it again in their 20s, and now they take it again in their 40s, they may see a difference. And the difference really has to do with the clarity that we have. Not that you've changed, because you don't, but that you have more of an understanding and insight into yourself. The younger you take it, the more likely you're influenced by your peers, by your parents, by your teachers, by your situation, what's hot at the moment, and so forth. Once you get up into your late 30s, 40s, and on, generally speaking, you can pretty much figure out your true type. You have more insights into yourself. And one of the things, and this goes back to your earlier question, Michael, about work and adapting, I realized early on at work, I happen to be introverted, intuitive, thinking, perceiving. And for my basic personality type, it means that I don't necessarily enjoy big social gatherings of lots of folks. And my first big real job, I quickly understood, and my boss was who was a great mentor and coach, told me, no, Rebecca, we have to go to these social events and hobnob with people. And I was just like, oh, I'd rather crawl through glass. Don't make me go. And he said, no, okay, so we'll do it and we'll do it slowly. You can spend I want you to, this thing we're going to next week, spend the first 5 minutes talking to someone you don't know. Think about some questions, have them up in the beginning, some topic of conversation in the news or something. And so you can go and spend your 5 minutes, and then you can spend the rest of the time off in the corner with your close buddies. So I did it. And so the next time we upped it to 10 or 15 minutes. Well, today at my advanced age, I can go to my chamber networking functions and interact as I'm going to do this evening with tons of people. Be more outgoing, be more extroverted in my interactions. Now, when I come home, I'm going to be exhausted because that's not my energy source. But what I've learned to do is learn the skills of the other. And so now I can do it. It comes pretty easily to me. But at heart, I am an introvert. I get my energy from inside, so I need to have that downtime. Extroverts need downtime too, just not usually in the same way. So it's learning in all these situations to understand who you are, understand what those other skills are that you need to be able to pull out when you need them, put them away when you don't, speak the other person's language, and then always be yourself. I hope that was helpful and useful.
Well, I think that resonated with me, and it resonated, I'm